Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. I think for many MLAs in this legislature, what has become all too common are those days that become seared in our memories and the memories of our communities. For the Cariboo, August 11th, 2017 is certainly a date that we will all remember. And it's important that this legislation is being brought forward. It's important that we work, all of us in this legislature, to ensure that the people, our communities, British Columbians, have the supports necessary when a disaster impacts their community. Cariboo constituents have been deeply impacted by wildfires, followed by the devastating aftershocks, if you will, of the very real and devastating impacts in communities. So how we modernize, how we make the necessary changes to respond to these emergencies is very important to all of our communities. I want to take a moment, if I may, to provide some feedback to the government. I certainly, as many members of this House have done in the past, have had the opportunity to extensively engage with government on the experiences that many of us have had over the years, our constituents, and how we can make the necessary changes to ensure that our communities are successful when you look at mitigation, response, and recovery. Following the devastation of the 2017-2018 wildfires in Cariboo North, one of the things that was critically important is that we all came together and spent a considerable amount of time to reflect and to look at those lessons that were important, that what we learned throughout the entire process. A team of experts from universities came forward. We had a think tank. We engaged with Indigenous communities, ranchers, local governments, and we put extensive work together in putting a roadmap forward on how we should be addressing emergencies in our communities. I was really proud of that work. I think it was very critical to at least our region starting to think about how we process and move things forward. What was disappointing, however, is following that 2017-18 wildfire season, followed by, the government putting forward a think tank to look at how we find those lessons and how we address these issues, is that think tank and that report got buried. Those lessons learned got buried. That information that was critical to ensuring that no other British Columbian had to face the experiences that we did in the Cariboo, that report was buried. And I want to talk a little bit about that today, and I'm going to be pulling some pieces out of an FOI report that is critically important that I think should be in this legislature, because it does tie into what we are trying to achieve in effectively modernizing this legislation, the Emergency Disaster Management Act. So again, we had an exposure bill that was tabled years ago, and unfortunately, the government failed to bring that bill forward in a timely fashion, and the results have had a significant impact on people across this province. Look at this last year. Look at the people of Lytton. Think of all those communities, rural, remote, Indigenous, that are still waiting for supports. I have people who were impacted in 2017 that are still waiting for recovery supports. Bill 31 is a different bill, and while there are pieces of the legislation that I am hopeful will address a small part of the challenges that we certainly identified through the extensive process and think tanks that were set up following 2017-18. I don't think it is comprehensive enough in the fact that the very real challenges and lessons learned in the past is that what this legislation appears to be bringing forward is something that's far more bureaucratic, more red tape, that legislation that will create more complications, challenges, and delays on the ground that will have a negative result in supporting people on the ground. So let me explain, if I may. From this past wildfire season in the Cariboo, and I think I bring the experiences forward because, again, this is about how do we all learn those very valuable lessons so we don't continue to repeat them. So we have talked in this House, many members have, of the critical importance of having local people on the ground, professionals that, trained professionals, skilled professionals that have access to, equipment and know the areas, critically important, including both our Indigenous populations, but also our ranchers, our loggers, our contractors, our placer miners, people that work in the outback, our guide and outfitters, our trappers. It's all critically important that that experience that they have out in the outback is incorporated into how we address wildfires or any emergency. So this past year, under new regulations that were brought in, I guess, in this last year, we have found new onerous and bureaucratic processes that have local people turned away from working on wildfires. So local contractors in my area who currently work with the Ministry of Transportation and the Ministry of Forests, so they actively work with other ministries in government, so they're good enough to build roads, build bridges, to work on the ground supporting other ministries, were not able to actually work for BC Wildfire. And, one of the excuses or one of the nuanced paperwork that has come in is about an e-file. While this increased red tape means for somebody that one of the individuals, contractors that came into my office said, well, look, we filed the paperwork, they lost it, so we've refiled it. It took 3 weeks. And when you're in the middle of a wildfire season and you need that contractor out on the ground at that immediate moment, waiting 3 weeks for a paper box to be checked, an e-file tax to be checked, is ridiculous. And I don't think this legislation is going to solve that immediate challenge that our contractors are facing. And look, we have highly skilled individuals in our communities that, again, work closely with other ministries that have been kept away from working with BC Wildfire. So hopefully this legislation, and as we go into the ability to go through each of the sections, hopefully we'll have the opportunity to look at that. Another contractor shared the fact that it took almost 3 days to gather up all the necessary new paperwork that was required. Again, work with other ministries, so work with the Ministry of Forests, work with forest companies, so, they're trained, they've got, their work safe, they have all of their required pieces, but they're not able to actually work with the paperwork for BC Wildfires, and we've got to get that right. It's not rocket science. And why do we wait to 2 weeks before a wildfire season to make sure that we have that necessary paperwork in place? And I hope, again, that this legislation provides the opportunity to have more streamlined ability to get contractors up and running in the winter months so that we're prepared. Because, look, these disasters, they're going to happen again. 2017-18, all that work that we put in, if any of the things that we had identified were actually implemented, it would certainly have helped communities in the Shuswap and Kamloops and Monty Creek and all of the other areas that were impacted following the disaster that we experienced. But again, we continue to be on this roller coaster ride where we talk about how we're going to improve things. We consult, we bring ideas forward, we talk about legislation, then we go back out, we consult, and then we continue to see the exact same or worsening results, which we've certainly seen. And this also doesn't address how we respond to disasters. You know, this past year, when we talk about the preparation, look, we were running around for pumps and hoses in our community. We don't have the necessary water trucks, so when government says, look, we have all of the resources necessary to respond to these emergencies, well, in our rural remote communities, we don't. And we're not prioritized. We understand that. We don't have the interface communities that, are their larger populated areas, but it continues to be an ongoing challenge that we have in our communities, finding ways. And I am pleased that the government is looking at how we support local volunteer groups to make sure that they're able to be trained, that they have the proper gear and water tenders to help support efforts of addressing, disasters in communities, I think is critically important. Experience on the ground is really important. I wanted to bring up, though, what I've heard back from our volunteer fire departments, our brigades, these volunteer groups that really exist in unincorporated areas. And this is where we've seen these massive expanses of these large wildfires in the province. All volunteer-based, and we are so grateful. Let me say, on record, how grateful we are for all of the volunteers, of all the frontline responders, whether you are volunteer fire department, search and rescue. There's a long list, and in each of the communities, it's a little bit different. But you step up and you put significant hours in. I talked to the chief of the Kearsley Volunteer Fire Department just a few weeks ago, and one of the things that he said is there's this new onerous level of paperwork that volunteer chiefs are now required to fill in, and it's really pushing away volunteers across the province, critical volunteers that we need. Again, he said it's almost like a full-time job now that this volunteer fire chief has to fill out paperwork in order to to check all the boxes and that have now been required. So we need to do things smartly, and I am worried that this legislation is going to create another level of bureaucracy that just makes things far more difficult for people on the ground to do the work that is necessary. I also wanted to take a moment to talk about how we're fighting these fires, and it's critically important, and I don't think it gets enough attention, and I think it's important that I elevate the conversation and raise it here in this legislature. I think a lot of people have the experience of seeing what a wildfire looks like in an interface community. So you see a community like Kelowna or in the Shuswap where it's interface large populations and what a wildfire looks, and there's lots of immediate attention on that. What really goes unreported, and I think people feel absolutely abandoned in our rural, remote, and Indigenous communities, is we have these massive wildfires. And really, because they're not interface and because they do not directly impact people's property immediately, the fires burn, and they let them burn, and they don't prioritize the resources onto those fires. And I can share with you what it means to have almost your entire backcountry burn. And we've seen it. Look at the Plateau Fire. Like at the time, the Plateau Fire was the largest fire in BC's history. That's our livelihood. So if I could deliver a message to government and to the MLAs who are looking at improving upon, on modernizing how we address emergencies, I want to share with you that when you let the backcountry of British Columbia burns, it takes away our economic ability, it impacts our wildlife, it has an impact on our livelihood, and it has very real impacts of people who live out in those areas. Those people feel abandoned, and I hope that this legislation that is before this House helps the people in our remote rural communities feel that their voices will be heard and that there is a place for them, a place in this province where they won't be forgotten. So let's talk about what happens to people and communities after an emergency goes through their community. Look, it's still fresh in people's minds what we saw, the horrific image that we saw of the people who've been impacted this last summer by wildfires. We've seen it by the floods in the Fraser Valley. You know, we've seen it in Lytton. We've seen it year after year. There's been a lot of impacts on people and community. And one of the things I can share with you, the members of this House, and hopefully this legislation will address, is that for our communities, you can't get insurance. So in rural, remote communities, resort, wilderness areas that have had wildfires, it limits your ability to even access insurance companies. They just won't insure. If you can happen to find and insure, the cost is so cost prohibitive that you're just not able to do it. And then that impacts your ability to get mortgages, and the banks aren't included in this conversation. And it is critical that the government has these conversations with the banks, because I can tell you when it takes 3-4 years to work through disaster financial assistance to get the necessary support, and the banks are looking at foreclosing your business or your property, whether it's a ranch or whether it's a resort property. We've had those experiences. It is pretty challenging to have a constituent in your office who saw the loss of their business due to an emergency like a fire or flood, only then to have the trauma of what it means as they try to rebuild, just to have every single step that they take be re-traumatizing. I hope this bill will address that. So what are some of the lessons as well that we can learn? Well, one of the challenges that we have in our Indigenous communities, I think that one of the areas that is a gap is that we do not recognize often that a lot of our Indigenous people live in our urban areas. And I know people will laugh when our urban areas, Quesnel, Williams Lake, and we've got I've got 41 small communities and Indigenous communities that are surrounding, in the Cariboo, a very large population, but, they're very small communities. And a lot of the people find, that in the Indigenous communities that they've moved into the urban settings, and there isn't a lot of supports for what happens to First Nations living in urban communities. And that is something I hope that the gaps in this, I hope that this piece of legislation addresses that. Another issue is, of course, the lack of connectivity. So this, as a government, we're driving to modernize everything to be online, and whether it's an emergency that you have in your community, they put everything out via, we'll email it to you, like get on this email report. Well, 60% of our rural remote communities don't have access to basic connectivity. And I have areas in my riding that don't even have landlines, so it's all satellite phones. And look, cell phones 10 minutes out of any of our, town off of Highway 97, you just don't have connectivity. So when we're talking about modernizing this legislation, we really need to do it with the lens of understanding that there isn't equity of connectivity across this province, and that we need to make sure that, again, people in remote, rural, Indigenous communities, that there's a way that we're communicating with them to keep them safe. And I think that's critically important. I do want to share this one story. Dave Gilbert, rancher in my community, homesteaded in the 30s with his family, was deeply impacted this summer. He's been impacted a number of times. Here he has fire 100 meters from his property, and he comes in, and he's pretty calm. He knows, he goes, look, we've been through this before, and so we're going to help. And so I said, Dave, the government said that they're going to help. our ranchers. So let's try and call this line. Like, let's see what happens when we call this line, because they said, we have all these, I think he had 120 cow-calf operation out on range, and we're trying to figure out how we move cattle and livestock, and that's the experience of MLAs and folks living in rural remote areas, is how do we help our constituents sometimes get access to some different supports that maybe in the urban areas don't experience. Well, first of all, he was directed to to go online for emergency management support. Well, he doesn't have broadband, so we brought him into our office and we, tried to make the calls, but there was this long gap. So we finally get somebody, on for assistance, and it's, like I said, it's fire on his doorstep. And they were going to give him a fan to cool his cows in a barn. Boy, sitting in my office for that one was, again, just demonstrated the disconnect. So the more that we're able to have local people as a part of the solution to how we respond and help support people, the better. Look, nobody wants to be in those embarrassing situations. I want to make sure that our people are supported and helped. But sometimes I think there is a strong disconnect of what it looks like in rural, remote British Columbia. And hopefully this legislation reflects on that and moves forward on that. At the beginning of my comments, I talked about, what are some of the lessons that we've learned? And, this bill does talk about, what are the steps? I think it's really important, and I applaud the bill for saying, we do need to do a review every 5 years. That's critically important because things are moving fast in this whole climate emergency space, and I think it's critically important. But I want to take a few moments because I don't think I have done that in this legislature, because again, it was a report that had to be FOI'd. And I'm going to read some of the elements of the report because I think it's critically important. So it's British Columbia Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. Post-wildfire hydrologic risk assessment, West Road, Blackwater River, and Narcosley Creek watersheds, and the final report was May of 2018. And I'm doing this because part of this bill talks about the needs for local governments to do risk assessments. So the reason why I'm reading this out is because this bill requires local governments to do the risk assessments. So I would like to spend a moment on what the province's responsibility is around risk assessments. When they do the risk assessments and government doesn't change any of their operations, where is the accountability there? So again, this report was done following the 2017-18 wildfires, and it starts with the hydrophobic soils, an opportunity to review soil conditions to determine the presence of and extent of water repellent soils. Pre-fiber forest disturbance, the study watersheds have long history of disturbance from forest pests, historical wildfires, timber harvesting. So it talks about what they came up with on that. Overall, the West Road, Blackwater River, Narcosley watersheds had pre-fire ECA estimates to be around 32.8% and 40.9% respectively. And then it talks about throughout this report what the new challenge will be on the watersheds. It talks about the forest-related fire disturbance, the impact of the 2017 wildfires on the ECAs within the study watershed values, and it talks specifically about the Uchinico River Basin, the Narcosley Creek watershed, the Snaking River subbasin, and the Kleskas Creek Basin. In watershed units where large areas of moderate or high severity burns affected mature forests. It talked about the impact on the Nico Creek subbasin, the Klesbako River, the Nasco River Basin, and the Totri Creek subbasin, and the impacts on that. You should note that if you go on to the BC wildfires of note from this year, what has been identified in this report is what we are seeing in these wildfires of note. So what was assessed back in this report in 2017 and what you need to be looking out for and prepare for, guess what, folks? Government had the risk assessment done in 2017, 2018, but didn't take the necessary steps that identified in this report we needed to do, so we wouldn't be in the exact same position this year and have the significant impacts. Number 4, post-fire flood hazards. While all watershed units in the study, watersheds have accumulated levels of forest cover disturbance that suggests their hydrologic regimes may be changed relative to pre-disturbance baselines. The following 7 units are a particular concern given the high levels to very high levels of fire-related impact. West Road, Blackwater River, which is the West Fraser Road, which just was a road that cost $104 billion of taxpayer dollars because the impact on that road. Nasco River, significant impacts on roads out in that area, the Klispaska River, Tawtree Creek, Anico Creek, Bezico River, and Coglistco River. In each of the above noted watershed units, there's a very high likelihood that hydrology at the stand and watershed levels have been negatively impacted by the 2017 wildfires. Then it goes into the spring 2018 freshet. It talks significantly about what we needed to prepare for in 2018 for the freshet season and the impact that all of these wildfires would have on our community. And guess what? 2018, 150 roads were damaged in the Caribou North riding, 200 the next year. We are close to $1 billion just in Caribou North in road damage. And you know, what the report talks about are some of the mitigation pieces that can be done to ensure that in areas, and there are assessment pieces through this whole report that talks about each of the areas, what needs to be done. You need to look at, what kind of maintenance, road maintenance, what kind of culvert upgrades, if you need to make sure you're doing your ditching, all of these pieces that contribute to making sure that you don't have the significant damage as an impact on these major wildfire events are critically important. It talks about elements at risk, fire-related riparian disturbances, post-fire sediment yield potential, post-fire channel response potential, overall post-fire hydrological resist, 2018 flood potential. While I can also tell you we had a lot of landslides, like we have people that have now had to move out of their homes. No disaster financial assistance. I know that the member from Carribbee-Chilcotin talked about that this week, about the fact that people on the landslides who have been impacted by landslides, they have to move out of their home. And guess what? They're now also responsible for cleaning up their property. So not only do they lose their entire life savings in their home, they're now on the hook to make sure that that property is demolished and taken away. Update burn severity, future ECA modeling. So there's modeling in this. It talks about floodplain mapping, review channel stability, riparian disturbances, potential soil erodibility, hydrometric monitoring. It talks about a lot more erosion pieces, and then we go into rainstorms, and it talks to, in addition to the potential snowmelt-driven flooding, the spring, summer, and fall rainstorms have the potential to trigger flooding in the downstream of burned areas. Look, didn't we have some issues in the Fraser Canyon? Right, when you start looking at the landslides, so all of the risk mitigation that were all identified, look, government has them. Government has all these reports. I say first, release all of the reports. If we're going to modernize emergency disaster management in British Columbia, you know what would be the first thing? Is release the reports. Let us look at the findings that have happened in previous disasters in British Columbia. Let us look at what the experts in the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resources, the Ministry of Water, all of these people that have come forward to say, look, these are the issues that we're going to have in the province. You want to make a difference in the province of British Columbia around emergency management, disaster management, recovery, mitigation? Release the reports. You know, this is a government that is so secretive, they want to hide everything. Look, we're going to go out, we're going to consult, we're going to make sure we have all of these groups, and then we hide the data, we hide the information that would prevent this from ever happening to another community member in this province. And yeah, I get frustrated. I see the impacts. And it's not just about rebuilding homes and communities, and that is so tragic. It is the Caribou at this point being at $1 billion in rebuild because we didn't listen to what the report said in 2017 and 2018. This legislation doesn't cover that. It needs to, and I'm calling on the government to release all of the data that actually helps make a difference in emergency management in British Columbia.
Thank you, member.